Welcome to Thrive and Shine HR, a podcast and video series dedicated to helping us overcome the limiting beliefs, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome that so many of us HR professionals face. Here are your hosts with over 45 years experience in HR and certified life coaches, Jen and Catherine.
Ooh, that intro gets me every single time. Just about the imposter syndrome and the things we need to overcome, our limiting beliefs, all the things. Well, welcome everyone to episode 39. Today we're talking about workplace conflict, and is it harmful or is it helpful? Jen, how are you doing today?
Oh my gosh, I'm doing great. And I agree with you. Every time we hear that new intro, it really kind of gets, I feel myself just kind of moving in my seat. I'm doing well. It's been a really busy week. I was in Vegas last week for a conference, which was incredible. I got sick coming home. So I was just sharing with you in kind of our pre-conversation that I'm now back on the upswing. So I'm not at 100% yet, but I'm feeling myself getting there. So it's been a little wonky in that way, but I am so happy to be here with you and be talking about conflict. So this is going to be a good one, Kathy.
Amazing. I just clicked on live. I don't know if we've been recording. I hope we have. My end said it wasn't, but we are recording.
We are.
Okay. That was a really good example of not active listening, because I did not hear a word you just said, Jen, honestly, because I was just watching the clock and I'm like, oh crap, we're not on. Okay, we're on. Good. So will you repeat that just for me?
I was saying that last week I was at a conference and got sick.
Yes.
But I'm doing so much better now, and I'm happy to be here with you.
I'm so happy to be here with you. I wish I had like a big cup of tea, because at the time of this recording, it's Friday night. My Friday nights look a lot differently than they used to in my early years of HR. I remember my HR director, one of my HR directors, one of my mentors, I remember her asking us to stay late early on in my HR career on Friday nights. And I was like, oh, hell no. Like Fridays are super good to me. But now, like, I really look forward to chilling out and having some tea and resting and rejuvenating after a long week. So anyway, I'm glad you're better. I'm glad you're home. I'm also glad you went to that conference. That's pretty cool.
It was a good one. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I got to see Kelly Clarkson. I got to see Viola Davis talk. So it was pretty special. And it was all through the new HR payroll timekeeping system that I think I've shared before. I'm like, because we go live on the 16th of December. So it's coming up really quickly, but being able to be a part of a community where I can now have different people I can reach out to and call. There's something just incredible about that, just to be able to have a support network.
I mean, that's, I think, is a big part of what is missing for so many HR professionals, that support network that you just mentioned. And whether it comes through our payroll resources, whether it comes through this podcast, whether it comes to you from your team, whether it comes to through social, it doesn't matter. I want to make sure our listeners know there are so many ways to get support in HR out there. Mm-hmm. Open your eyes to the possibilities. There may be some right under your nose that you're not even aware are there. So Jen and I are always here for you. And whether this is your very first podcast or this is your 39th, you've been with us since day one, it doesn't matter. We're so glad you're here. And just as a little bit of a refresher, Jen and I started this podcast because we realized there was no podcast out there like it. We realized that, we wanted to show up and be real and talk about limiting beliefs, talk about imposter syndrome, talk about our experiences that we have had in HR over the 50 plus years of combined experience that weren't so positive, because you're not alone and you're not doing anything wrong at all. We are just continuing with the way we have learned HR from our predecessors. And Jen and I just want you to know there's a different way to HR. There's an absolutely much more empowered way, and we're here to share that with you. And Jen, before we really dive into today's episode, I'm curious, you'd be willing to share with our listeners, give them a little peek behind the curtain of what we were talking about earlier this week with our amazing social media manager, Sam. Like, can you share all the things we've been working on? Just give our listeners a peek behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, if you haven't already noticed, we have really stepped up our game when it comes to social media. And I'm so excited for it. Having Sam has been just a game changer. So not only is the look and the feel of our social media starting to kind of expand and kind of help us step up to the next level, we're also really looking at kind of shifting our framework for 2025, where we're going to have guests, which is super exciting. We're going to have, each month we're going to mix it up a little bit, where you and I are actually going to have some time where we, will be kind of hosting on our own when we bring guests on. So I think this is going to really help not just revitalize, but really help take this podcast to the next level and help us really expand on what we already know at our core is something that's so needed and so magical and so helpful. In addition to guests on the podcast, we're, working on behind the scenes, getting a newsletter up and going. We're behind the scenes playing with, trying to get a sponsor or two so we can really kind of get, some funding that'll help us be able to put out the best possible content to you out there. So a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I think is really going to make for an exciting 2025. Did I leave anything out, Kathy?
No, I know. I think the only other thing that really got me when we met this week was we really want to hear from you, our listeners, about what you need and want to learn in 2025. So Jen did a phenomenal job in Google and has come up with a form to ascertain what you I don't know what's happening at my house.
Is everything okay?
My heart is just like pounding. Oh my gosh, I think it's the dryer. I think it's breaking into my house. It was so loud. Oh my gosh, I apologize. Okay. We want to know what your wants and needs are in 2025, because we don't want to just get up here and start talking about the things we think are important. We want to make sure you, as our listener, like you're chomping at the bit to come to every single podcast. It's not about us. It's about you. We are like in our 50s. So let me tell you, we are here to serve in a whole new way. There's something really magical that happens as you age and you just want to give back. And Jen and I have arrived, and that's where we are. So we want to make it we want to just like have that be our legacy in a way. And this is how we're doing it. So we're super excited to just connect in a whole new way next year and keep the momentum going with the podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And I think a big part of it, what we really started with on this podcast is getting really honest about our mental health, our emotional health, our physical health, our social health, our financial health, all of the elements that come under that wellness umbrella of health. Mm-hmm. And Jen, when you really think about workplace conflict, which is our topic for today, episode 39, I'm curious, when you look back over the course of your career, how much time would you estimate that you have spent on resolving conflict at work, preventing it, ruminating before or after work, losing sleep over it, when you think about the trajectory of your HR career? How much time do you think you have actually spent addressing conflict? What number would you give it?
Oh my gosh, significant amount of time. Gosh, it's hard to put a number on it, but I would say that in the last year, since I've kind of taken on a newer role, and I've done, more of the work that I've done to be able to show up with, more confidence and more clarity. I would say the amount of time that I spend on conflict, on resolving, on ruminating, on all of that has significantly gone down. And one of the things I noticed actually today that came up for me is still this tendency deep within myself that's a habit, really. And it's
Ooh.
really around people pleasing, and this idea of wanting to, calm and tame and get to, resolution as quickly as possible so that no one is upset and everyone's happy and we're all happy, right? Everything's fine. That was me for 20 plus years in my career in HR, where,
Dang, yeah.
the goal was that we don't want conflict. That's a bad thing. This idea of this
Uh-huh.
bad thing. And so coming, all full circle to a place where, one, I've learned, and I'm still learning, because today it came up for me where I was like, "Ooh, Jen, there it is,
Right
this little kind of gremlin that pops up in me that's like, ooh, let's try to kind of calm this down as quickly as we can."
there.
Versus, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but the skill of being able to allow and not, resist that conflict that might be present, so that naturally things can move through. So yeah, I mean, in terms of number wise, I'm not sure, but I would say significantly less than it was before, because now I can recognize within myself the
Yeah.
tendency of wanting to please and try to, calm things down, and being able to kind of move through it much easier than I would have ever before. So yeah, how about you? What comes up for you in terms of like what you would have done in the
Mhm.
past around conflict, and how much time it was taking up your day?
Yeah, I mean, I have completely done the work. I mean, I went through full on brain, I call it brain rehab 3 years ago. So I approached life and work completely differently. But what I experienced before I did that, I would say it was at least 50% of every single day. So I want to give a couple of examples for our listeners so that our listeners know they're not alone when they feel like they're experiencing conflict all the time in the workplace, especially right now. At the time of recording, it is the Friday before Thanksgiving. Um, and all of my clients that I'm working with are in the middle of open enrollment. So, open enrollment, in my mind, is a way of preventing, it's educating our employees. And we are in some way preventing any, with open enrollment, it's all about education. So we're trying to prevent miscommunication, prevent an employee from selecting the wrong voluntary life insurance policy, or selecting an HDHP when they thought they were selecting a PPO, or misunderstanding the difference between an FSA and an HSA. There is so much baked into open enrollment. And in a way, those educational sessions are all about preventing conflict, right? Preventing any sort of conversation in the future that could be, well, I didn't know about this benefit, or I didn't realize that the family premium had increased by 16% this year. So when I think about conflict, I maybe think about it a little bit differently. And I do think people who are in open enrollment right now are spending so much time preventing conflict. I also think about the employment law seminar that I sponsored last week. And I spent 8 hours in an employment law seminar with 80 other professionals in the HR professionals in the region. And that entire 8 hours was about preventing lawsuits, preventing conflict, making sure our policies are written in a way where they are clear. There's no conflicting information. We're super clear and we're aligned with federal, state, and local laws, plus the policies we want to put forth internally, right? So to me, I think about it through that lens. So my answer is a little bit different. I mean, this time of year's budget season, oh my gosh, we want to be super clear on how we intend to spend our dollars in 2025. So I think about conflict that way too. And as I'm saying all of that, I mean, my heart rate is starting to pound because I remember starting 7 years ago as the first ever HR director, HR professional for a medium-sized organization. They had never had HR. And I remember budget season started and they were like, here you go. There was no training on the system they used for the budget. Like there was nothing. It was just like, here, go for it. And I was like, oh my God, well, I don't want to ask for help. They obviously think I just understand the system. Is this a zero-based budget? Like what process, what system does this particular organization have? And so there was a lot of inner conflict going on with me while dealing with a process that, if I'm being honest, it was about, okay, we have this bucket of money. What department's going to get a new hire? What department's going to receive money to add to the payroll budget so that those promotions can take place? Who's going to get the dollars next year? So that process also created conflict amongst the executive leadership team trying to do the grab for money. So in my mind, and maybe this is like very telling of my personality, it felt like there was conflict all the time. I felt like I was just swimming in it. So if there are any listeners out there who are like, girl, yeah, I think about it before work. I think about it after work. I wake up in the middle of the night. Please know you're not doing anything wrong. It is just how HR has been positioned and structured and how processes have been passed down throughout decades. And there's a different way to go about it. And Jen's already spoken to it. It's all about your inner game, all about how you're responding. So, I mean, kind of flipping the script a little bit, Jen, and you've spoken to this a little bit. Is there ever a time, an appropriate time to encourage workplace conflict? Going to the other side of the coin, like, is there good conflict? I read about this all the time. You know, all the experts are saying, of course there is. I want to know what you think about this new trend when it comes to a new lens on conflict.
I mean, the short answer is yes. You know, I definitely would agree with any of the people out there who ask that question of, is there good conflict? Well, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
and really it's a reframing of the word itself, right? In terms of, disagreements or misunderstanding, whatever you might want to look at it. But what I've noticed over the course of my career is that at the end of the day, if you have circumstances where there's difference of opinions and there's, misunderstandings, ultimately you're going to find yourself continuing to bump up against a wall over and over again if individuals, if the people who are representing and involved in the circumstances don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, they don't feel safe, they don't feel respected. So ultimately, what I've truly found and what I have kind of adopted within myself in terms of, being an HR leader is like, it can be very easy in a way sometimes to go right to the heart of it, to go right to the heart of the matter and just let's resolve it. Let's move on. Woo. And it can be like almost like a simple concept that ultimately is much more nuanced than that. And so what I have really found is the answer is always going to be yes, that ultimately until you can get to the core of what's really going on, and there's always going to be more to the matter, right? We are emotional beings, and ultimately there's always something that's going to be under the surface. But if people don't feel safe, they don't feel as though, they can really kind of put their truth out there and be honest and be genuine in a way that's going to allow that openness with others, then it's almost like you're kind of fighting a lost cause, and I think that that's where it really can be tricky in that way of like, what is it? What are your real intentions with this? Are you just trying to solve for X? Or can we look at the bigger picture and recognize this is how trust is built? This is how respect is built. This is how psychological safety is built. It's through sometimes slowing ourselves down through these types of moments so that we can really get a sense of that bigger picture. And I think as HR professionals, that can be really tough to do because we are so much fixers, and you and I've talked
Totally.
before that we're such fixers and people pleasers, right? The fixers
Double
and people
whammy.
pleasers of us really want to kind of go right straight for it. And so part of the training that both you and I do is really helping people to be able to see that bigger picture so we can recognize that as humans, sometimes, that's really, I think, the secret sauce of being able to then get to the point where we can address the conflict or disagreement or misunderstanding in a way that's going to allow people to be able to kind of speak their truth and not feel like it's confrontational. And I think that that's a huge differentiator that can be a real challenge often to get to because it does require more patience, requires slowing down. It requires a willingness to kind of sit in that discomfort more than perhaps we may want to. So there's different parts of that I think, when you layer it, on top of it, itself, it can feel a bit overwhelming, especially when you don't have maybe the tools and the skills that you and I do. But here, you and I are to tell our listeners and viewers that it is possible. It is something that is so, so worth it to recognize, hey, you know what? Conflict in and of itself is actually not only important, it's essential. And we have to be able to kind of find our way to it. But if we're doing so and not also looking at the human element, then we're going to find ourselves almost like in a hamster wheel, getting ourselves stuck right back in the same place. It's just going to be a different issue, a different thing, but the core is not going to be that much different. So what about you? What comes up for you when you think about, the goodness or, the necessariness of conflict in the work environment?
I mean, I think all my brain just started thinking about was Munch AI. It's a software that allows me to replay this video and take clips from it and then post on social media. And in the explanation that you just shared, there were about 7 or 8 golden nuggets. There was so much in what you just shared that was so on point for our listeners. If you are not watching this live, go back. Like hit that 30-second rewind button 3 times. I want you to listen to what Jen just shared because it was good. And if you're like, oh, time for that, let me recap what the main points that I just heard. Confrontation. God, that was good. When we're approaching conflict in a confrontational way, when we're expecting confrontation or we're leading with confrontation, that is indicative of someone's emotional intelligence. Do they have the awareness of how they're coming across? Do they have the awareness that somebody else is experiencing a shitstorm in their own mind if they are being confrontational? It all comes down to emotional intelligence. This has been a hot topic in HR for years. And what continues to surprise me is that we are not teaching the skills associated with emotional intelligence in the workplace. We're not always exhibiting those skills of curiosity. I mean, that is the quickest antidote to confrontation that exists. And curiosity is a skill, and people don't know that. So when you notice that your inner game is off a little bit, you're feeling confrontational, there is emotional conflict going on, whether you're witnessing it or you're involved in it. Curiosity, the quickest antidote. And we'll talk about techniques how to get into that. But kind of circling back to the initial question, when I think about it, is there ever an appropriate time to encourage workplace conflict? My answer is the same as yours. Hell yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the research I've done on this and what I incorporate into my trainings on workplace conflict that I deliver, it's the difference between intellectual conflict and emotional conflict. So you said the exact same thing, just in a very different way. And when we are disagreeing about how to make things better in the workplace, maybe there's a disagreement about the interpretation of the Power Act in Colorado. And do we need to be taking severe and pervasive out of our unlawful harassment? Do we need to take that language out of our unlawful harassment policy? Or what do we need to replace it with? So if there's a disagreement amongst the decision makers, when you're talking about what is the right language in a policy upgrade to come into compliance with state law, for example, that's the greatest conflict you can ever have. When you're having those high level conversations and you're just seeing it a different way, that is the greatest conflict that we want to welcome. We want to harness. We want to make sure is happening in the workplace. Otherwise, it's homogenous, and we are probably making decisions way too quickly without welcoming somebody else's ideas, brainstorming that opportunity to ideate, all of those types of things. So I totally agree with you, Jen. Conflict is super important. What we don't want to encourage is that emotional conflict. We want to recognize it the minute it happens and then use our tools to mitigate that.
Mm-hmm. So good. So good. And that's where, that awareness, right, of our own kind of emotional triggers is so powerful, because I know, just like you, in kind of years past, it wouldn't be until later on I'd be like, oh, and recognizing how my emotions then completely were guiding me in ways that took me way off the rails, right? Whereas now, the quicker that we can get to a point where we can see how our emotions are causing us to perhaps maybe interpret or perceive things a little bit dramatically, we can then kind of get to a place of being a little bit more regulated a little quicker, right? So I love that so much.
Amen. Oh my God. So and we'll get to examples in our past lives of when we lacked that emotional regulation, when we misunderstood, what was going on. But I have a weird question for you. Did you grow up with the phrase, "I have egg on my face"?
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've heard that.
Right? And for those of our listeners who did not grow up that phrase, it just means like you say something, you behave in a way, and in hindsight, it's like, oh my God, I'm seeing it a totally different way. Sometimes there's some shame in there. Hopefully that shame is replaced with laughter and levity and, okay, I did the best I could at the time with the information I had, with the emotional experience I had, and I'll do better next time, right? But egg on your face is like this. Oh my God. That's what egg on your face is, except it's like dripping down your face and, there's a lot of visuals. Okay. So Jen, next question. And this is what's different about our podcast. Again, like Jen, you and I are not like trying to get jobs out of doing this podcast. This is not like LinkedIn. We're not posturing here. We get real on this podcast. So I'm curious if you'd be willing to share with our listeners what you've learned about conflict at home that has taught you valuable skills that translate to the workplace.
Oh,
you see that question?
Oh my gosh. Well, the word that you used earlier is curiosity, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that I have, work at home has been something that in my previous lives, my 9 lives, struggled with, because I've always so strongly independent and so fiercely independent to the point where it's really very difficult sometimes for me to kind of step outside and be able to, approach things with a mindset of curiosity. So, I've been married now 21 years, and my husband and I, we have our disagreements and our conflicts just like any other couple. But one of the things I've definitely recognized within myself, especially over the last few years, now that I'm really starting to kind of utilize and practice the skills that I have, is the tendency to want to jump immediately to, kind of that confrontational place, right? Because it's almost habitual in terms of how we relate to those people that are closest to us. My 17-year-old leaves, plates out and, is just being a 17-year-old kid. And without even thinking, my brain immediately goes to, wanting to, kind of go at him and get confrontational. Like, pick this, da, 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 da.
Totally.
Versus, being able to just slow my roll and take a moment and be more curious, be more inquisitive, be more, just learn a little bit more patience. But it's so fascinating how difficult it is with those that are closest to us, versus sometimes in that professional environment where we know so much is,
totally.
kind of rides on it in terms of, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to get in trouble, right? Whereas at home,
that's interesting. That's an interesting distinguishment. Yeah. Keep going.
Yeah, where you can immediately kind of go into that place and not have necessarily those checks and balances that we would in the professional environment. And what I'm finding more and more, which is really fascinating, is the more that I practice this at home, the better I am at getting these, working at these skills at work, and vice versa, right? But the home one, and that's where it's like so funny you asked that question, because that's where it gets really vulnerable. I'm like, oh, it got face. It's like, for real, that's where I struggle more than I would professionally, is having that patience, leaning in with curiosity, not immediately rushing to judgment, taking my time in these types of matters so that I can really make sure that I'm, cultivating and nurturing the relationship versus, going straight towards the jugular on things. And it's gotten better and better and better, but I am not perfect. I still have work to do. And it's in the home life that it definitely finds its little it finds its way out in ways that, kind of catch me off guard, and it humbles me in the best possible way. So I definitely, I'm calling myself out on this, and I know that I have a long way to go, but I know that I've come so far. So
I love that.
what about you? Where you want to get a little vulnerable with us and talk about how?
Girl. I mean, I put the questions together for this episode, so I was like, I guess I'm going there. I guess so. My mind spins a little bit on this one, because if I'm being very honest, right after I completed coaching school, I mean, it was 6 months. It was intense, and I was in it, and I was just having aha moments right and left. And I remember, it's so ironic because it was Thanksgiving time. Brett and I don't have children. I do have permission to talk about Brett. Love you, honey. Brett and I don't have children. So when I think about Thanksgiving, that is when we come together with our families. And we live pretty far from both of our families. My family's back in Ohio, his family's in Texas. And so what's so interesting about what you just shared is, I couldn't agree more. The stakes are pretty high. The emotions run high with family. And yet in our case, at least, we spend more time with the people we work with than our blood family. Mm-hmm. And yet those Thanksgivings, those holidays, those times with blood relatives can be some of the most emotionally intense, and where I see, like, in hindsight, myself included, like, the lowest expression of emotional intelligence out there, right? Like,
Yeah.
I fall back into being the middle child and needing attention. And then I'll be the only one doing dishes for the 30 people in my family. And I start thinking, oh my God, here I am, like, being a people pleaser. Nobody's offering to help me. Everybody's playing with their kids. Everybody's having cocktails. And here I am scrubbing it. Like, this has been a pattern in my family for my entire life because I am the one without kids. And man, I just turn into a different person when I am back home at Thanksgiving. And getting back to my point, right after I went to coaching school, I feel like my emotional intelligence was almost at the highest. I was so compassionate. I was so curious. I went through this phase of just seeing things very, very differently. And over time, because I'm not practicing my coaching skills 900,000 hours a day. I mean, I do with my clients all the time, but it's just a little bit different. And I'm also like, I show up with that curiosity. I show up with that compassion. And then I think about tradition, and I think about my aging parents and how much they love Thanksgiving. They love the tradition of Thanksgiving. And then I have other family members who are like, well, we don't eat meat. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm total Gen X, like, okay, that's great. Yes, I understand. Like, bring your own food. I've been reading all these Reddits about this lately. And just that compassion and that curiosity. Sometimes I'm really able to tap into it, and yet it can be if I'm being really honest, it can be very, 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 very challenging during those family experiences. So I don't even know what I intended to say, but that's what just came out of my mouth. I mean, talk about total honesty. And I'm aware of it. That awareness is ever present. And sometimes to this day, I still get very defensive for my parents. And I'm like, it's probably, if we're being like honest, it's one of their last Thanksgivings where they have all their mental and physical faculties. Can we just honor the tradition that has been passed down over generation to generation and not say, well, can we also have this meatless food? Or can we be teaching our children how to say, no, I don't eat meat? Like, can we be teaching those skills of assertion, those skills of respect, those skills of confidence? Like, so yeah, my mind's all over the place on this one. And it just goes to show how much, when there's emotional conflict going on, and how different it can be from family and in the workplace, to reiterate what you just said. Like, I don't overthink that kind of stuff when it comes to work. Like, I know how I need to show up at work, right?
Yep.
And the skills, that skill of curiosity, it sort of combats with, if I'm being honest, in my brain, respect. And then I'm like, ooh, where's my humility? So yeah, I'm all over the place. How's that for vulnerability, Jen?
Well, I really love that you brought up Thanksgiving and the emotional baggage that comes with all these different dynamics that come with those events, right? Because especially for those of us who are not close to, or physically or emotionally with family, but there's so much that can go into it. And I think that in the work environment, that's not necessarily the case, right? It's day after day after day, and it's
Totally.
kind of the same people and the same types of dynamics, and they can flare up and that sort of thing. But when it comes to the type of practicing we can do when it really gets to some of those bigger events, some of these skills are going to be massively beneficial to get into
Amen.
those moments, to be able to have that awareness, right? To be able to
Yes.
see that and recognize that. But in those moments too, we're human, just like anyone else.
Totally.
Really being able to have kind of that sense of kind of understanding of how triggering some of these events can be, and how we can really kind of step into a newer version of ourselves when it comes to being able to have these types of engagements with others that we don't
Absolutely.
see as often.
Yeah. And what's coming up for me is you're sharing all of that. And after I just like blawed all over the podcast, we have like, they say between 30,000 and 60,000 thoughts a day. So just because, for example, when I'm having those thoughts about, well, why can't we just teach the kids respect? Like, what a great opportunity, Thanksgiving, to teach children how to speak up for themselves and how to say their please and like all those things. Those are just thoughts I'm having. So am I going to act on those thoughts, or am I going to say, that's just a thought?
Mm-hmm.
What is my goal as I'm going into Thanksgiving? I want to experience love. I want to show love. I want to focus on love. I'm going to focus on love for myself. I'm going to focus on love for other people. And so what I want our listeners to understand is, just because you're a coach like Jen and I are, just because you have these skills, it doesn't mean the thoughts are going to stop. But
Right.
once you do have the awareness to say, oh, wait, I can actually choose a new thought, and you can choose it over and over again, and how you show up, that emotional intelligence, that thought intelligence, that's the game changer we're talking about. And it applies both in family situations and obviously at work too, which is really powerful stuff. So
Absolutely.
totally. And so Jen, like getting into some tactics, some tools, what are some ways and some tools that you keep yourself in the right frame of mind, or at least get yourself back to the right frame of mind when it comes to dealing with other people's conflict in the workplace? Let's go back to the workplace. Let's go back. Let's go forward to the workplace.
I think one of the biggest things that I've learned to be able to do when it comes to conflict is being able to compartmentalize the different parts that go into how I might get pulled in to conflict, right? And so when there is conflict and there's a situation, I think in the past there was a huge part of me, and I was talking about it before, this idea of like fixing things and pleasing people,
Totally.
but I end up putting a part of myself into the equation, right? And my my tendency to want to have a happy ending for my own peace of mind was playing a part in it more than I ever
Yeah,
realized.
totally.
And I think that when I could start to break that apart, when there's, something that comes up, I'm more like conscious around what is it that I'm carrying with this? How is it that I'm, ideally wanting, this situation to be resolved, or what outcome am I, wanting to try to manipulate or, create in some way in the situation. And I think the more that I've been able to just be aware of those things, and sometimes we don't
Yes.
have the time to do that, right? But I'm talking about like if you have 5-10 minutes, whatever it is, before you're actually, that, the manager and the employee and, whoever is about to come over to your office, and just being able to quickly go through my mind and say, okay, what is it that's going on within me that might create a tendency within myself to try to, try to move the conversation or move the situation one way or the other. And that, I think for so long, I didn't really recognize the problem in that,
Yeah.
like the true issue within that, because it's ego based, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the
Yeah.
awareness of it in and of itself was a
Yes.
massive thing for me, just to be able to recognize that me, my own ego, my own, tendencies were coming into play. And so pulling that out, the next thing that I would say for myself is then the real gut check around my own emotional state. Because if you're going into a mediation, right, like I know that that's something really, really well, you're going in to mediate some type of conflict, and my own kind of emotional state is one of annoyance or frustration, or I'm feeling resentment because I really wanted to work on this report, or I really wanted to work on this, and now look, we've got these people, coming in and bothering my day. what is it that's going on within myself that's going to potentially create a inability to really be able to show up in a way that is going to be the best for the greater good. And those are the types of like, and they're almost like small little tweaks that can be made, but over time they really, really build exponentially, because
Yeah.
it almost starts to become a skill that you can fine tune. And so I think, the first time or two, or even 5 times, it feels awkward, it feels kind of weird. I'm like, okay, what am I what am I trying to do here? But over time it starts to become more of a flow to it. And I think that that's been a really, really massive shift for me in being able to just be able to show up in a way that is going to serve, like I said, it's going to serve everyone, versus me getting caught up in my own head and not really realizing that that's actually coming out in some way that is now creating a divide, or it's creating a little bit of turbulence when I may not have fully been aware that I'm actually influencing it more than I may have realized. So what about for you? How do you find yourself kind of getting into that right frame of mind?
Exactly what you just described. Truly, as you were talking, I'm like, yep, exactly that. And what comes up for me to help drive the point home with our listeners is the premise of coaching is that our thoughts inform our feelings inform our behaviors, and our behaviors inform our results. So Jen, when you were just sharing about, the thought that keeps coming up for me as you were speaking, and something that I have in my back pocket, and I practice this thought all the time when I'm dealing with workplace conflict, is this is not about me. This is not about me. And that helps me. I'm just driving your point home, which is so ironic because I did not know what you were going to say. But that is it's like a power sentence. It's a power thought for me. And I have practiced that thought so many times because I am a certified mediator, right? I'm a certified facilitator. So I oftentimes, in the work that I do now, I'm dealing with conflict. I'm dealing with mediation. I'm facilitating conversations to mitigate conflict. And that is one thought that I would love our listeners to try on, or an iteration of it, because what Jen just described as, we don't sometimes really realize that we're making it about us. And that's just our ego. We're not doing anything wrong. It is very, very natural for the human brain to do that. And when I say to myself, this isn't about you, I get calm. And I'm able to show up in a way that is totally different than the way I used to show up in the workplace before I understood that thoughts inform feelings, feelings inform behaviors, behaviors inform results. So I want to reiterate that. And our thoughts are very, very powerful. They can either be empowering or they can be disempowering. And that's one that really helps me. Another one that really helps me comes from, and I don't know if I'm paraphrasing this or if this is a direct quote from Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Fifth Agreement. The greatest battle anyone will ever have is the battle in their own brain. Mm-hmm. And when I remember that, and when I think about the shitstorm that goes on up here sometimes, to understand and know that other humans have the same shitstorm. They have the same thoughts, right? We all go through fight or flight or freeze or fawn. That is our emotional response, and we can't control that. That's another thing that's really important to remember. So if you feel like you're out of control, totally normal. But then Dr. Jill Taylor out of Harvard, she's a neuroscientist. She's proven that we can only feel those emotions for 90 seconds. So all of the things that I just shared help me get to the right frame of mind. I tell myself it's not about me. Choose that thought. I remember Dr. Jill Taylor's work, like, let them have their 90 seconds. If they're spinning out, they can't control them. So practice the power of pause, let them have their moment, realize they're in a self-induced shitstorm. But after about 90 seconds, that's when I start in with a very simple question of, what do you want to experience? Mm-hmm. And there are the 4 tidbits baked in there, just very much aligned with what you just shared.
So good, though.
I know.
So good. I mean, you just added on in such a powerful way. So thank you for that. That was like, I'm like, I should be taking notes here.
I mean, but this is the thing, like, because of the work I've chosen to do after the 9 to 5 HR world, I deal with conflict all the time. So I have had to come up with these ways to keep myself calm so I can serve in that capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I obviously just articulated right before that when it comes to family, I'm kind of a self-induced shitstorm still. Let's get real. There we go. Okay, so let's take it back. Let's go back to circa like the fat-free era. I mean, do you have an example of a time when you were involved in conflict at work, where, where you didn't approach it in the best way, and maybe a recent example where you've kind of applied what you've learned and that you've come a long way in terms of addressing conflict?
Yeah. So this has been about 10 years now. We had a manager who at the time I was HR director, and we had a manager who was really, really struggling because they were military and now they, really truly believed that their style of leadership was effective. And this was before I really learned and knew a lot of the skills that I do now. But what I did know at that time, and what was very clear, especially with this particular manager and the senior manager, was it wasn't effective in the sense that we were having significantly major issues with turnover, engagement, morale. All of those things were just awful, right? And so one of the things that I was tasked to do was to work with this manager and to really help them understand that by, yes, having kind of that military background, if you want to be strict, you want to be direct, those are all great things. And can we start to be able to care for and spend that time with the individual, because they were very much disconnected, right? They didn't really recognize the value of engaging with their employees, spending time to get to know them, really building a relationship. That wasn't something that they felt like was necessary for them. They felt pretty grounded in their sense of identity. And so part of my role was to really work with them and try to help coach them and spend that time with them. And what we were finding, we spent over a course of a 6-week time together, and almost every session we would have or conversation we would have, it would end up with like this kind of bickering type of thing, because he was not understanding and I wasn't understanding, right? It was almost like it was kind of like just not really kind of listening and connecting with one another around. Both of us really had a lot of value in terms of what we were bringing and what we were offering to one another in that dynamic. But I was trying so hard to just force feed this individual to change. And this individual was trying so hard to force feed me into understanding why his way was the right way and was effective and worked. And so at the end of our 6-week time together, I got nowhere. It didn't really make a whole lot of difference in the matter, and ultimately the individual got let go because of other circumstances, but we're really all related in it. And in retrospect, I can see so clearly that I was stubborn, that I was trying really hard to kind of force, the square peg into the round holes, so to speak, that I wasn't really just accepting of who this individual was and try to then come to a common place together, right? And try to kind of find that ability of really building, that bridge that ultimately you can get that buy-in. And at the time, 10 years ago, I didn't quite recognize that. I didn't see that for
Yeah.
the value that I do now. And
Mhm.
so fast forward now in terms of like how I would relate to these situations, we've had, a manager where, I work now that we've been working with and kind of having challenges with, but my approach and my ability to address the situation and be able to accept that individual exactly as they are, right? And without really trying to resist the the reality of who that individual is, but instead being able to try to get the buy-in from where we're at and be able to paint the picture of where it is that we're wanting to collectively go. And I think that when it comes to conflict and when it comes to disagreement, that has been one of the biggest things for me that has shifted dramatically, is to be able to get that sense of buy-in from the individuals involved, so that there is a clear picture we're working with versus like the grandstanding that can happen, and definitely was what was happening with me 10 years ago. And now being able to slow that roll just a little bit, just enough, so that we can really get to a place where we're all maybe speaking more of the same language. And that
Mhm.
takes more time. It takes more patience. It takes more
Yeah.
curiosity. It takes
Yeah.
more out of me energetically, actually,
Yes.
ironically, even though 10 years ago there was, quite a bit of conflict that came from those 6 weeks with that manager. Now, in working with, the different managers or individuals where I'm struggling because of confrontation, energetically, it takes quite a bit more, because
Mhm.
I'm having to restrain. I'm having to like take some
Interesting.
greater consideration within my own self, that before I would have, those 90 seconds, let it fly, right? Because there wasn't that awareness to slow that
Dang.
down. But it takes a lot out of me energetically to actually then slow myself down for those 90 seconds and hold that in. And it's not that I'm holding it in from a sense of it's not valuable, it doesn't matter, but it's really because for the greater good of the situation, it's not going to serve anybody. And so sometimes those 90 seconds are, we're face to face, right? You're not going to
Totally.
necessarily know I'm going through it. My face might be starting to get red. You're still going to go through those emotional
Totally.
phases, but through a
Totally.
sense of like more consciousness and awareness around it, I'm now needing to kind of hold that in a different way. And then later on, maybe I'll find a nice punching bag and be able to let that shit out. Whereas, in
Gloves.
the moment, I'm not going to do that quite so much. And that's, what's so fascinating is when we kind of go back to the question about home versus work, that's where the work is still being done for myself in the home environment, because I know I can do it. I know I have it within me. So why sometimes I still allow myself to get triggered and let it fly? That's
Yeah.
the work that still needs to get done,
Oh my
but
God.
that's
That's
okay. And I
interesting.
think in recognizing that, it does take energy, it does take, something out of us. But really, when you're looking at it through the big picture lens, it's so worth it. It's so, so worth it. It's just different way of processing and relating that requires just a different set of skills. All right, girl, let's flip it.
Oh my God, but I have there was so much in there. Again, I'm gonna have to watch this on rewind because you
Yeah.
just made me think of so many things. I know that's true for our listeners as well. So thank you for sharing that. My mind just went to, do you think because we do put so much energy, we take so much pride in the work that we do in HR, that we've been able to come so far in terms of the skills we've developed in terms of helping with conflict in the workplace that we're exhausted by the time we get home, and we just kind of have nothing left to continue with that application, that practice of curiosity, because we're just so cooked. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that, right? And I think that, when we are, really kind of taking advantage of the skills that we can learn that can help us be able to navigate through conflicts and confrontation, then I think ultimately it's so important that we recognize that we are not forgetting ourselves in the process.
Yeah.
And recognizing, okay, what is it that I'm going to do for myself in order to help my nervous system be able to re-regulate after being able to kind of hold that space for, the emotional turbulence that sometimes comes with it. So I think, I mean, that's a really, really great point. Whereas, in the past, I would not even necessarily be aware of it. And I'd probably come home and I would still be railing and still kind of all over the place because I'm not really getting a sense of recognizing what's really going on and being able to kind of have that awareness and then recognizing, okay, how can I take care of myself in the process so I'm not then going off to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing without then being able to kind of give myself some TLC.
Thank you for adding that. Because neither of us ever claimed that any of this stuff is easy. And yet, I just love your vulnerability and your honesty that, like, when you are trying these new approaches at work, it's exhausting. So just that awareness of, I'm trying something new and it's exhausting, and I have to be conscientious and to take care of myself so that, that exhaustion doesn't ripple into life after work, which we're allowed to have. I don't know. That was really powerful. What I think about is how much time I spend reflecting back on workplace conflicts that happened many moons ago, still to this day. And ironically, I've been thinking a lot post-election about women. I mean, I always think about women because I stand tall for women's rights. I really believe, regardless of political affiliation, I have to say that right off the bat, like, I just want to empower women all over the world. I don't care what your political affiliation is, because I'm looking at this globally. I just want women to stand tall and know their value and to realize that we've been socialized differently as men. I need men to understand that too. I mean, I could go on and on for days about that. But I specifically remember when I was hired, there was this is 7 or 8 years ago. And this is before I went to coaching school. I remember that one woman came into my office. I was relatively new, maybe like a month or two in. And a woman came into my office and said, we are experiencing discrimination in the workplace because we're women in this specific department. So she convinced 3 other women to come to my office one by one. So you can imagine the time that this project, this informal investigation took, right? The time, the emotional energy, especially as a woman, and I got very invested in this, and I was like, not on my watch. No way. Not in this that was a very like Me Too era at the time. My dates could be off. But I think that's when I really started becoming much more of a feminist than I had been prior. And I got pretty fired up. And to the point where I was like, this is a big deal. I'm going to bring my boss into this. The 5 of us women and my white male boss sat down, and he said, yeah, I can see that this is an issue. This is a problem. And I ended up writing a report. I submitted the report to my boss, the recommendation. We all know how this goes. I'm over here having these sidebar conversations with the women saying, thank you so much for coming forward. We don't stand for this in the workplace, so on and so forth. Eventually followed up with my boss and said, okay, it's been you know how this goes, Jen. It's been a couple weeks. What are we doing? What are the active steps we are taking? And he decided to sweep it under the rug. And I think about that to this day. And the way I showed up, I still feel shame around it. All of those women quit, not surprisingly, one by one, slowly but surely, full turnover in those positions. All men were hired after that. And I did not have the confidence, the skill of confidence. I lacked the skill of advocacy. I lacked the skill of curiosity to ask my boss, can you explain to me why we're not going to take any action on this? Mm-hmm. So all of those skills were lacking in me at the time. And I didn't see it that way. It was more of this, well, he's the boss. And I let it go. And I still think about it to this day. And I don't know. I just think I've been thinking about that a lot lately for some reason. Today, I would handle that totally differently. And the way, again, I don't want to like sound like I'm hammering something home, but for me, that skill of curiosity actually it's kind of the opposite of what you just shared. It takes so much less energy for me. I feel energized when I'm curious because I don't have to like prepare my talking points. I just show up and I ask a ton of questions, but I'm truly coming from a place of compassion because I do believe that people are doing the very best they can with the information they have. And I think there's a lot of unconscious bias in the workplace. And if I just show up and ask questions, I can understand where that person's coming from. And I can then, that power question of, well, what do you want? Like in that scenario, if I were to flash back 7 years ago, well, why is it so important for us to not address this? Like, what is our end goal that we want to achieve by not addressing this situation? That's a pretty powerful question. And I think the incantation, and that truly wanting to understand why my white male boss made that decision would have been instrumental. Yeah. So for me, that curiosity element is like, oh, I don't have to overthink it. I don't have to stay up all night, like worrying about it. I'm just going to come from the heart and find out where he is truly coming from. And then just there. I don't know. Yeah, I've been thinking about that situation a lot lately from way back when.
Yeah, but I really, gosh, I love what you said about, kind of that recognition, right? Like at the time, it wasn't something that you really had the tools and the understanding to be able to address differently, but to be able to kind of see that and know that, ultimately, having that sense now of how you might have approached it and saw it differently, that sets you, obviously we can't change the past.
Nope.
But to be able to kind of have those experiences that we have really is instrumental then in how that you would approach it now and
totally.
And how you can help coach the people that you work with and how we can coach here at the podcast and because of given having had that experience. So it's awful that happened, but what a beautiful thing in a way to now be able to kind of have that experience and say, oh, I can see now how I would definitely be able to react and respond in such a different way now.
Such a different way, such a more empowered way. And like you said, I'm truly grateful for that experience because it has led me to be this woman who stands tall for women around the world. I mean, that was just one incident of many. And I was 20 years into my HR career. So even with 20 years of experience, when you are new to a position and you're like, I don't know my boss that well. Like, those are totally normal things to happen, regardless of your tenure in HR. And just know that the techniques that we've shared today, I mean, Jen, you've had some gold in here today. We have given some viable techniques and tips and tools for our listeners to use. So just to help with that conflict, that inner conflict and that external conflict. There's been some goods. I'm going to watch this again. You had so much earlier. I was like, oh my God, I have to go back to like minute 17 or something. It was probably right there. Well, Jen, as we admittedly enter into the holiday season, it's go time. I mean, from here on out to the end of the year, we are entering into the holiday season. And do you have any advice for our listeners when it comes to family or work conflict? Because I do think, sometimes people are like, they kind of kick it for the rest of the year. Maybe they have a lot of PTO. Maybe it's just this, I don't have sales goals to meet, or I've met my sales goals, or whatever it is. Sometimes people take the foot off the gas. Conversely, because shit goes down at Thanksgiving, people come back to work, they are not mentally, emotionally well. So I'm just curious what advice you have for our listeners about dealing with conflict around the holidays, both in family and at work.
Yeah.
The hands.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that you brought up in that, because it's inevitable, and that type of turmoil that, could be presented to any of us at any given time is so outside of our control. And so, starting with, and you had said it so well earlier, this is not about me. It's really about like recognizing how powerful it is to understand that it's not personal, that anyone's emotional triggers or turmoil that could come to us at any time is not about us. It's not about you or me. It's about whatever's going on with them. And so, being
100% highlight, pause, rewind 15 seconds and listen to that again.
Yeah. And it's so difficult to be able to do. I mean, it's so easy for me to say that. It's so easy for you to say that. It's so easy for us to be like, oh yeah, don't take it personally. It's great. And that's so much easier said than done. But repeating that mantra within myself has been so important, especially when I know that I'm going into a turbulent or a difficult time. And the holiday season it's going to be a little rocky for most people in some way or another, whether it's professionally or personally. And so being able to kind of guide ourselves through that and not allow ourselves to take those things personally, and being able to kind of have that sense of self that is so needed during these times is really, really powerful. And then the second thing that I would say, and I'll keep it super brief, but it's really about finding that support. I just yesterday had a counseling session, and I'm very vocal and very open about counseling and therapy, and I think it's so, so important. And so I think that whatever that looks like, and I've brought this up before on the podcast, whatever that looks like for you, whatever that looks like for anybody out there, to be able to know that I am able to release, because it's one thing to release, our physical bodies and exercise, or release in some, other fashion where people are letting loose and letting go. But scientifically, it's been found over and over again, there is something massively beneficial about the release of vocally being able to communicate and being able to get out of us, because it allows us to process through. So whether it is through, a community organization, whether it's therapy, whether it's whatever it is, being able to
Hey,
find those
to the
outlets
men. Yes.
to be able to kind of process through and get out allows us to be able to kind of go through and kind of push through. And yeah, it's just a major thing that I think can make a huge difference. So I'll keep it brief with just the two. Try not to take it personally, and finding that support, and knowing that, we're here. We've got so many different things that we could recommend to anyone out there. So if there is anyone out there that's struggling, that feels alone, that feels isolated, especially this time of year, reach out to me personally, reach out to Kathy personally.
Oh my God, totally.
We would be so happy to kind of help talk that through and find the best options for anyone to be able to know that they're not alone at any time. So that's my preaching for today.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I'm going to piggyback off that. I want to keep it to 2, keep it short and sweet. We talked about this earlier, but just remember, you can choose a thought upgrade at any time. Do not beat yourself up. In the spirit of Brene Brown, the shitty first draft that comes into your head, the SFD, if you experience judgment of a relative or judgment of a coworker during this upcoming holiday season, it doesn't make you a bad person. Mm-hmm. That thought is probably on repeat, and you can choose a different thought. You literally can. There's a lot of other steps involved in there, but just know you're not a bad person if you have a bad thought. Just recognize that thought. I always picture a feather. This must have happened for me when I was really into meditation a few years back. I still do meditation. I just do 20-minute long ones. I do like 10-minute ones. But I just remember that the guided meditation was talking about a feather. And I think about that all the time. I have a visual. Like if I have a thought of, why aren't my siblings teaching their kids manners? Right? And then it's like, oh my God, you're such a shitty person. You don't have kids. Who are you to think that thought? Yeah. All those, like, it's like, nope, let the feather go.
I love it.
Right? And don't beat yourself up. And the second tidbit that applies to both work and family for me, and I say this aloud all the time, and people, when I say this to them, they're like, oh, that's good. This happened at the Verizon store the other day. I needed a charger for my phone, and the guy was like, thank you so much for being nice. It's just been a day of really bad people. And this is what I said to him, because I say this all the time. Well, I'm responsible for the energy I put forth into the world. And he goes, yes. And then the other guy at Verizon was dealing with a customer. Both of those men, it was 3 men and me in the store, pretty small store. They both were like, yeah, all 3 of them, excuse me. They were like, yeah, that's so true. And I was like, I walked out of the store and I was like, oh my God, I just really impacted people's days by just sharing a mantra that I choose over and over again, which is, I am responsible for the energy I put forth into the world. So if you are at that ticket counter, if you are at the airport, if people are screaming, if babies are crying on the plane, it's like, just come back to your power. Mm-hmm. And remember that you do have control, and you have control over your emotions through your thoughts after 90 seconds, according to Dr. Jill Siller. Lots in this episode today, Jen. Thank you so much. You had some gold. I just appreciate you so much. And what you shared today will help me over the holidays. I'm forever grateful. Thank you. Your words of wisdom.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As always.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it. Please share it with somebody you love. Please share it with anyone that you think needs to hear this. Marguerite, we're so glad you're with us today. I'm seeing your comment pop up. We're so glad you're here. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Marguerite. I miss you. We spent some time on the beach together recently. So love you, girl. Happy Thanksgiving to you. And to all of our listeners, please, please, please remember that every day is a great day to thrive and shine in HR. We'll see you for our next episode.
Bye, everybody.
Miss you too. Bye.